Welcome to Getting Ghosted. This is an Intuitive Soul Collective podcast, and I'm your host, Allie Horner. I am doing today's episode just kind of seeing where it takes us. I know that a lot of people have been sending in requests and questions for Anna and Roger, who have both been coming through and visiting us from 200 years in the future. And my hope is to hopefully be able to answer a couple of those questions for you. Remember too, for those of you who are new to the podcast, I actually really started doing this work by channeling spiritual guides and people's, grandparents and spouses and boyfriends and parents and kids who had passed. And my journey really started with that type of channeling. And really in the very beginning, I didn't even know that I could channel. It just kind of just so happened that I started having some very well-known people who had passed away who were kind of like popping up and talking to me from the other side. And I thought I was losing my marbles. I didn't know that I could do this type of thing yet. And so that's how this all started for me. I started actually publicly channeling people just about 10 years ago or just over. And at this point in time, I didn't know that I was capable of this yet. I just knew that I felt compelled to share it. And there's so much more to that story. And for those of you who are new, go back to the first couple of episodes and you will see the story about my spiritual awakening journey and how I started channeling, how I started to get into this, what happened for me, because mine was very sudden and very overnight. And I go into more detail about how this all started. So just in case some of you didn't know, that's actually where I started. I didn't actually start by channeling people like Anna and Roger who are living in Earth's future. Or if you heard the episodes, I also did some where I was channeling some people who were from 6,000 years in Earth's future. And so that's actually not originally how my channeling started. It's just something that started to spontaneously happen for me over the last couple of years. So I just wanted to mention that because I think some people weren't really aware of that. And so if you are interested, those episodes, there's a ton of episodes, especially at the beginning of this podcast, where I go through and talk about mediumship and how to know if you're a medium and how my journey started, things that happened for me, different signs that you're a medium, ways you might be blocking it, signals from intuition. I channel a lot from my guides, Eric and Sam and Grace and Joy and the whole, what I call my A team or my spiritual team. And there's a lot of really cool channeled information and messages throughout the podcast. So feel free to go back and listen to those as well. But yeah, I felt compelled to tell you guys that. I also have more information. You can go to the links down in the show notes. My link tree's down there. My website is intuitivesoulcollective.com. And then I'm also Spirit Speaker 25 on TikTok. No, just be really careful because there's a lot of imposters. I only have one account. So just know that, I will never reach out to you, etc. But anyways, on my website, intuitivesoulcollective.com, and on my TikTok account, and then obviously Substack, my podcast, Instagram, etc. You can always find more channeled information there, and all sorts of things that I've been sharing from the past and stuff like that. Some of those accounts are newer, some of them are older, but you'll be able to find so many fun things there. And then of course my Patreon group. So yay! Without further ado, let's get started for this week's episode. Real quick, before we get started with Anna, just know that this week we are in Gene Key 12. This is a really cool Gene Key just because it is all about speaking from the purity of the heart, or creating and expressing from the purity of the heart. This isn't speaking just to speak. This isn't about being obsessively, this doesn't come from insecurity. It's not a Gene Key and not a transit that comes from just that need to be seen and heard, or on the flip side, the need to hide, to sit behind a mask. This week is all about being genuine in our expression, really coming from the truth of the matter. So a great week to work on your intuition, seeing things clearly and asking yourself, what needs to be said, what do I need to bring to the moment right now? And just know that this is not always about speaking in terms of speaking in conversation with other people. It may be also about making sure you're bringing love to the moment in any way, shape, or form. So this week is also about artistry in a huge way, like the poets, the prophets, the songwriters, the musicians, if there's a creative project or something that needs to come out of you this week, you might feel those tugs coming. So notice how this is showing up for you. Again, it's Gene Key 12. We're here until June 19th. And just remember, gate 12 is the gate of caution. So it's all about it's all about that expression coming in the right way, the right time, from the right frequency, and always given to the right people. And so this is a very considerate gene key. It's a very self-aware and considerate gate. And so just keep that in mind. And you can always look up your free charts online. By the way, I also have started doing gene keys and human design charts. And so there are a couple of openings for those, and you get to pick what your focus is on. So feel free to do that as well. My kind of specialty with this is more so helping you figure out purpose, career niches, things like that. I also, of course, call the guides in during it. And then I also really like helping people figure out, are there any gifts or things that I'm seeing that can really help you from your charts on their own. Often the charts, just for a lot of people, they kind of mirror things that you've already known about yourself, which I think is super cool. So feel free to check those out on my website, intuitivesoulcollective.com, or in the show notes. And let's get started with Anna. She is here. She said, this is fascinating. And she was talking about the gene keys. Okay, wait a minute. She wants to talk about the gene keys really quick. Oh, that's so fascinating. I didn't know she was going to do that. Okay. And she said, so the gene keys have evolved so much. And I said, so are you still very aware of them later? And she goes, oh, yes, but they've evolved a lot more to the point where we don't really use them as, she said, we're not dependent on them. And I was like, well, we aren't either. They're not very widely known. And she goes, oh, okay. And she said, so for us, though, astrology is still alive and well. And I said, is human design still known? She said it is, but it's evolved, and it's not as big as it is in your time frame. And I said, well, again, it's still kind of niche. She said astrology is still alive and well. And I said, well, what are they? Is there anything different about it? And she said, well, we have different sort of interpretations of things. She said, so Leos, in terms of your time period, you look at them as very boastful. They kind of have she said, you have more stereotypes. She said, we don't really have that as much. She said, Leos are seen more in our time frame. So remember, this is about 200 years in the future. She said, Leos in our time frame are just seen as more sunshiny. And she showed me a sunflower. And she said, we don't ascribe as much, we don't focus as much on the personality traits. We focus more on the season. She said, we don't look as much into personal profiles. I was like, oh, that's really fascinating. And she said, there is still room for that. It is like a niche, but we look more into seasonal changes, like the equinoxes. She's showing me, equinoxes. I was like, do you still look at new moons, full moons? She said, oh, yes, they're really beautiful. And she said, she's showing people cheersing with glasses of wine on a picnic blanket, looking out over a sunset. It's so interesting because the building I'm seeing in the background has some glowy blue lights too. It's not just yellows. Wow, that's really fascinating. She said, well, we do have new understanding of things. And she said, so of course, interpretations change over time. And she was showing me, and she said, of course, in your time frame, astrology in the Western world isn't the same as it was when it first started. Correct. And I said, yes, correct. A lot of the interpretation has changed as it's been westernized, as it's been used in pop culture. As it's changed in terms of interpretation, because different cultures also take a different lens on things. Western culture is very hyper independent versus the cultures that astrology came out of, which are more communal and collective cultures. They think very differently, which is hard for especially American and westernized civilizations to really think about, especially American culture, though it's very, very individualized. And so when we look at a system like that, she said, yes, exactly. You have to understand sometimes the interpretation of things. And she said, it's fascinating. But she said in the interpretation of things in your time period, it's yes, the planets are still the same as they were. The stars are still in the sky. The planets still all exist where they were. The sun and the moon's cycles, the sun, she's showing sun cycling. But she said, but for example, we just have different understanding and interpretation of things. And I said, so for example, in our time frame, there's kind of like this a sort of spoken about thing where ERs kind of know, oh, it's a full moon. We need to get prepared. And she said, oh, yes, there's actually data on that now. She said people do get in more accidents and stuff. Sorry, I had to pause to listen to her. And she said, but we aren't as disrupted as you are. And I said, well, what does that mean? And she said, our frequency has been changing on Earth because we have more renewable energy. We have cleaner foundations to work from. So we don't have as much of that frequency disruption as you do. And I said, does this go back? Okay. So you guys have to remember, if you haven't listened to part 1, 2, and 3 from her interviews, especially part 1 and 2, remember Anna's focus and her area of study, like her career. And so specialization in school was in energy. So, and not just like spiritual, everything is energy, like actual like energy, like renewable energy and clean energy and stuff like that. And she said, and also like plant fuel energy. And I'm like, girl, tell me everything. And she said, in water technology. And she said, she was like, there's certain things you guys wouldn't have vocabulary for yet. And I was asking her, I said, well, is it like the flux capacitor in Back to the Future? And she goes, what's Back to the Future? She goes, I'll have to look in the archives. Sometimes when I reference things for her and I'll bring up movies or things like that I ask her about or music, she's like, what is that? And she always says something about archives. And she said, oh yes, we have a collection of archives. And she's showing them being almost like a holographic system. Like, oh my God, this is like Iron Man, where you can hold your hand up. And she said, yes, it's very much like that. It's almost like a touch screen, but you don't have to touch it. And she said, it works with your mind. And you use your hand and it senses your hand signals without you having to touch it. And you can flip through the archive system. I said, can you voice command it? And she said, yes, of course. Like almost like, why wouldn't you be able to? And then she smacked her forehead with her hand. And she goes, oh yes, I forgot. There's certain things you don't have. And I was like, well, we do kind of have that now, actually. And I said, we call it Alexa and Siri. And there's a whole dispute over it right now. And she goes, indeed. And she goes, is it because of your wrestling with AI and like surveillance and stuff? And I said, yes, there's a lot of that going on. And she goes, oh, and she was just like, yes. Okay. And I was kind of like, I don't know if we want to go down that track today. But back to what she was saying. So you have to remember, she works in renewables, and she's in the first episode, she had referenced how our energy, our water, our frequency is lower. She said there's more buzzing in the air, more electrical buzzing for you. And she said it's not just, she said it's not AI, it's frequency from, she's showing satellites. She said broadband technology. She said everything that you guys have, it creates this low level hum, and it also pollutes the planet. She was saying there's a lot more pollution. She said much of your time frame, she said I had to study this in school. We had to memorize pieces of it and almost look at how your generations thought about renewables and how they thought about energy. And she said, so you guys used more gasoline. And she said, and ethanol really produces fumes and noxious fumes. And she said, there's pollutants in your air, there's pollutants in your water. And she said, because of that, your frequency is lower. And she goes, remember, we talked about this. And I was like, yeah, I was kind of repeating it for the podcast. And was saying, so when we think about how certain things are interpreted and how we might be disrupted because of full moons, it's not really the same. And she said, we do understand that the moons and the tides and all that are connected, but people, she said, it's not like we can like transcend all form and we're perfect, but we have certain things figured out with energy. And we've begun to clean up a lot in the air and water over the years here. And she said, it's not perfect yet. She said, like, our food sources are clearer of toxins and debris. Oh my gosh, this is so neat. And she said, so overall, our bodies and minds are less disrupted. And so when we think about things like a full moon disrupting electrical systems or making people get in car accidents or messing with people's heads and minds. She said, yes, that we still know that the full moon and that certain shifts do have a magnetic pull or do have some sort of, she's showing the tides. Like, she said, like, yes, there are certain aspects that, yes, we still understand and practice. And she said, but we aren't as out there with it. She said, you guys have some pretty out there practices that have no basis in science and will be found to be not. She said, yeah, they're going to be found to be nonsense. And I was like, care to share? And she was like, no. And she said, well, we just understand things differently. We have more technology, advanced technology. So there's certain things that we could study in more finite detail than you were able to. And I said, okay, I'll take that. I understand. And she said, but back to psychic channeling, she said, that's more common. We're also more aware of how it works. And we can't really be as, she said, we don't really have as much, we can't be as provoked. We don't have as much anger. Sorry, I got interrupted for a split second. And I heard, and now back to our show. But she said, we have more understanding of things. So she said, in terms of science and spirituality, she said they come together more. And I said, what do you mean about the part where you said we can't be as provoked? And she said, well, she said misogyny and romantic getaways, like romantic advantages, we can't be provoked as much. We see outside of that system more. And she said, of course, we still have romance and relationships, but we don't adhere to such strict conditioning. So she said, for your time period, you guys use a lot of psychic readings. Like a lot of people use psychic readings there to find out, like, when am I going to get married? Is this person going to love me? Am I going to be able to, oh my God, I was like, this is so interesting. And she was like, a lot of people are asking about like love and relationship, right? And I said, yeah. And I was like, have you been watching me work? And she was like, well, somewhat. And I was like, I have seen her pop in and been like, Anna, are you here? And she was like, I didn't mean to startle you. It's just more observing. And I said, okay, that's fine. It's not been a lot. I've noticed it once or twice. And she said, but really what I find fascinating is that your kind in your time period, like humans in your time period, are really obsessed with romance and the romantic relationship. And she said, I have looked in the archive since we last spoke. And she said, and so I can see how a lot of your psychic phenomenon, oh my gosh. Okay. She said, so a lot of your psychic phenomenon and your awareness of things is slightly distorted because of this fascination with romance and the significant other. And she said, of course, we still have love and relationship here and now, but we're not as contingent upon it. So it doesn't distort as much of our decision making. And we also understand scientifically what else is going on in the brain and body to a higher capacity. So we are not as likely to get thrown by messages that, for example, don't offer us a soulmate or what you guys would call like the one or the person for you. She said, we have more of a higher understanding of love and relationship. She said, it's not evolved so much per se, but she said, we don't really see being with a significant other as the only way to be. It's not the end all be all of things. And she said, we very much understand the cultural conditioning and the social conditioning, she said, as well as religious, political, etc., that created that in many of the cultures back in the day, which she's referencing like our time frame and before. And then she said, and so when you think about that psychically, like really think about if you are using most of your mind to wonder about a significant other, which she's not talking about me because I don't really date or even think about that. But she's saying like you, like the people listening, if your mind is preoccupied with love and relationship and romance and how to make someone else happy when they're barely giving you their best, right? She said, I believe you call it breadcrumbing. And I was like, that's so, yeah. And she said, or like ghosting you, like they disappear. And I said, yeah. And she said, so if you're preoccupied with these things and you're consumed with these things, your frequency is going to be lower and it's going to be more distorted. You're not going to be able to succeed very well because you're preoccupied with these things that are not really right for you. And she said, in our time period, of course we have love and relationship, but she said it's very different. It's difficult to kind of like hand everything over to a special love relationship. And she said, we have people we would call like mutuals. We call them friends, we call them lovers. We're more communal. And she said, we're less segmented into couples, like where it's just like this couple, that couple, and I said, well, are there couples who just live in their own homes? And she said, oh yes, of course. But she said, but there's less focus on it and she said, our cultures just don't really prioritize that. And I said, well, is that true of all cultures on your planet or just your culture? And she said, almost all. And she said, of course, there's some areas that are kind of lagging behind. Ooh, she's calling our culture lagging behind. And she said, well, it is. And she said, because you're so obsessive about, I said, wait, can you say that again? Did I catch that? Right. And she said, well, what we would call it is when people are obsessive about a significant other or having to have a boyfriend, having to have a husband and sacrificing everything for that person. And they're not even like self-aware or thinking about like, what is my purpose? What would I like to create on earth? Like not aware of the rest of the community because they're so obsessed with like this one special relationship. She said, we call that love rot. And she said, kind of like when it rots your brain, it makes you think only about this one thing. It's like an obsession. And I was like, yeah, I call that love obsession. She goes, yeah, we call it love rot. Wow. I was like, I've never heard that before. And she said, well, we understand that really differently. And she said that type of stuff really lowers the frequency. And she said, and lowers the bandwidth and your creativity as well as your connection to the rest of the community because it's so hierarchical because you put this one love and relationship over all others. And I was like, yeah, that's true. My guides have talked about that a lot. And she just goes, can you introduce me to your guides? I was like, oh, sure. Yeah. I was like, I didn't even think about that. But I did notice Eric popping in over to my right too. I was like, oh, I wonder if she just asked me, who's Eric? I'm like, okay. And I was like, my guide. And she was like, she's writing things down too, which I think is funny. But she said, I don't want to go on about it too much longer, but we can talk again another time. And I can talk more about what I want to tell humans in your time frame to help them with what they're doing. And she said, today, I would like to say to them to be strong in their faith in humanity and trust that things are moving in the right direction. But she said, but part of the reason we are where we are now, she said, in my time frame, is because many of you began to take action and clear. She's saying like almost like take charge of things. And she's especially showing climate change, the renewables. She said, taking care of each other. There was a large change. And she said, it can happen sooner, we believe here, if you continue to move forward. And she said, you might be able to see more of the positive changes happen sooner in your time frame. So we want to tell you to have faith, have hope in humanity. She said, we want you to understand how connected you are. She said, we're looking at it in hindsight. We can see it so clearly. Many of you who are on the internet, on your phones, you don't understand that. Like you don't see it as much because you're not out in the world. You have to get out in the world and talk to people and go participate in things. And then you'll see it. She said, you'll see it. So interesting today. I'll continue seeing what else comes through in the future. Feel free to keep submitting questions to Anna as well. Oh, she's jumping in one more time with something else. What is it? Oh, someone had submitted a question for her and they had said, have people in Anna's time frame figured out that some people are NPCs? Like in games, there are NPCs who are just like background players. They're not actual people or players. And she said, that's not true. And she said, I don't know. Like when I read that question, I felt her over my shoulder and she went, why would people think that? Like she was like really taken aback by that. And she said, there are no NPCs on earth in your time frame. And she said, that's really distorted thinking to think that there are people walking around on earth who don't have a soul inhabiting their body. She said, nothing could be further from the truth. Everyone who is here has a soul, has a spirit, and you are all deeply connected. And she said, you're all one at the end of the day. And she said, I really want to encourage that person to maybe seek out some higher perspective, or even seek out she is saying mental health counsel or psychological counsel to help them with that thinking. And she said something about it being, she said that kind of thinking is designed to keep you looking down at other people. It's really interesting. And I said, can you go on about that? She said, there's really little to be afraid of in other people. Statistically, most people are good people, but and she said, it's that fear, she believes, she said it's distorting and clouding judgment. And she said, I would encourage that person to really go and seek some higher perspective and talk to people around them more. Sometimes people aren't talking to people around them enough, and they might, she said, sometimes I wonder if people are misinterpreting other people's actions or responses. And she said, but there's no one that's an NPC. And she said, we don't believe that at all here. And she said, in fact, we understand more than anything that everyone is valuable. Like, humans are deeply loving beings. And she said, of course, we still have problems here. Not everything is perfect. We still have, humans are still very much humans in the future. And she said, but we very much want to discourage you from thinking other people are just empty shell background players. And she said, that comes from people buying into video game mentality too much. Ooh, wow, that's really interesting. And she said, I would encourage that person to maybe get off their phone and go out into the world and talk to other people a little bit more. They'll get out of that focus or that thought line a little bit. And I was like, yeah, it's kind of like people who call people muggles. And she goes like in Harry Potter. And I was like, oh, you know Harry Potter? And she goes, of course we know Harry Potter. And she goes, I don't have to look in the archives for that one. And I was like, right. So it's kind of like how sometimes some people call other people muggles. And she said, yes. And she said, it's funny because they forget that in Harry Potter, when people would call people muggles, it was to make a point that they were separate, non-magical, and therefore not as good, not good enough for the magical folk. It was a label intentionally created to make people who didn't have magic sound bad, like no mage or muggle or whatever. And she said, and people in your time frame, there are some spiritual seekers and people who use the phrase like, oh yeah, the muggles out there. And I always am kind of taken aback, like, you really look at people like that? Like, I don't like that phrasing at all. I don't like to call people muggles or NPCs and stuff. I always just find that it feels very empty to me. And almost like just people intentionally trying to put other people down. Like, I can almost feel like the people who say that about others, I feel like there's an insecurity there. Like, I'm like, oh, you don't need to do that to make yourself feel better. And she said that's exactly it. And she said, we don't look at anyone like that. We don't look at people and say things like, or othering. She said, there are, of course, some people who are, like, humans are still humans in the future, right? And she said, but we don't have that much of that sort of separated, or she said, like, judgmental, downward cast thinking, where she said, because while there are still some hierarchical systems in play, it's not as much as here. And she said that's an example of a hierarchical thinking system, where someone has to be above someone else. They can't be equal to each other. And I was like, right, I totally agree. I mean, she said, and it's hard for people to see when we study history in school. She said it's easy for us to see it in hindsight, right? Because we're looking backward. We can see it as a whole, whereas you guys are individually looking at it as it's happening and not really thinking about it as clearly. Like, you're creating the history as you go. And I was like, yeah, that's exactly, I get what you're saying. So yeah, and she said, but I wanted to make sure I answered that because she goes, I just don't think that that's right. She was like, I don't think that that's right. I don't think that people should be calling each other NPCs. She said, I really would discourage people from looking at other people as so separate from them. And I was like, wow, you guys really see this very differently in the future. She goes, oh yes, we all know we're more communally minded than you were. And she said, so we understand it very differently. We understand we are all human beings. We all have souls. We're all valued. And she said there's more science around the soul for us as well. And I was like, oh, I can't wait to ask about that next time. And she goes, indeed. And she said, it's part of the energy component. And she goes, but I'll get into that later. Okay. It sounds like we're complete for right now, but I do appreciate everyone listening to this episode. So thank you so much for listening. And if you want to submit more questions for Anna, Anna from the future, just use the link in the show notes or in the link tree, and you're welcome to do that there. Just keep in mind as well, the channeling course is starting next week. I'm getting ready to send our email out to everyone with some of our fun links to jump on our classes. There's also going to be some classes that are delivered more like week to week throughout the course where they're pre-recorded. So you'll be able to do them on your own time and all that fun stuff. And I'm sending some out in kind of batches and stuff. But there are also some fun channeling practice and live classes as well that will be recorded as well afterward. So you'll be able to watch replays of those and all the fun stuff. So if you've wanted to learn how to channel and really learn how to auto write, which is channeling through writing, feel free to jump in and join us for that course. Again, like I mentioned, we're going to be starting next week. It's okay if you sign up a little bit late, but if you do, you'll probably miss the first class, just FYI. But yeah, feel free to do that. And then of course, I always have my private readings on my website, and my Patreon group is open. Okay. Thanks so much, everybody. I hope you enjoyed this episode.